What if the real collapse of New York isn't happening where everyone is looking, but in places most people never think about anymore? Not in Times Square, not on Wall Street, not in the iconic skyline, but in small, almost forgotten airports where silence has replaced urgency and emptiness has become routine. Few people notice these places, and that's precisely the point. Collapse, in its most advanced form, doesn't announce itself. It lowers its voice. It removes friction. It makes decay feel normal. These smaller New York airports still appear operational. The lights are on. Security checkpoints exist. A handful of flights still arrive and depart. On paper, nothing is wrong. But walk through these terminals and something feels deeply off. The energy is gone. The sense of movement is artificial. You're surrounded by infrastructure built for a future that quietly evaporated. This is not abandonment by disaster. It's abandonment by neglect, by slow withdrawal, by a system that no longer needs these places but hasn't had the courage to shut them down. This is how modern urban collapse really works. It doesn't start with failure. It starts with irrelevance. Budgets shrink without explanation. Routes disappear without announcements. Stores close one by one. Maintenance becomes cosmetic. What remains is a shell, functional enough to avoid headlines, broken enough to signal that the system has moved on. These airports aren't failing loudly. They're being left behind silently. And that silence is not accidental. Silence is politically convenient. A closed airport raises questions. An empty one doesn't. As long as a runway exists and a plane lands occasionally, officials can pretend continuity still exists. But for the people who rely on these airports, workers, nearby residents, small businesses, the message is clear. You are no longer part of the future New York is investing in. There's a deeper psychological shift happening here. Airports are symbols. They represent connection, opportunity, movement, access to the world. When they decay, they don't just limit travel, they erode confidence. They quietly tell communities that growth is elsewhere now, that prosperity has been centralized, that their role in the larger system has been downgraded without consent. This is why these places matter more than they seem. They expose the uncomfortable truth behind the New York myth, that even the most powerful global city cannot sustain all of its own infrastructure anymore. Choices are being made. Resources are being concentrated. And the cost is being absorbed in places where few people are watching. Because collapse, when done efficiently, doesn't look like chaos. It looks like emptiness that no one talks about. It looks like airports that still exist, but no longer belong to the city they were built to serve. Before we go any further, pause for a moment and really process what you're hearing here. This isn't just about airports, and it's not just about infrastructure. It's about how decline hides in plain sight when no one is paying attention. And understanding this pattern matters, because once you see it here, you start seeing it everywhere else in New York, and far beyond it. If this perspective is already challenging the image you had of the city, I want you to engage with it, not just consume it. Leave a comment below and tell me this. Have you ever been in a place that was technically working, but felt like it was already abandoned? Or maybe you've passed through an airport, a station, or a neighborhood that felt strangely empty, like it had been left behind by time. Write it down. Your experience adds another layer to this conversation. And if this analysis resonates, if you value content that goes beneath the surface instead of repeating the same polished narratives, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. That's how this kind of deeper, uncomfortable analysis continues to exist. The more people understand these silent processes, the harder it becomes to ignore them. Because what we're uncovering here is only the beginning. These airports are just one symptom of something much larger, something structural, systemic, and quietly reshaping how life in New York actually works today. At first glance, nothing appears broken. The doors open automatically. The departure boards flicker with updated times. Security procedures are followed. Staff members move through their routines with mechanical precision. From a distance, these smaller New York airports look functional enough to justify their existence. But functionality is not the same as purpose, and this is where the quiet collapse begins. Infrastructure doesn't die when it stops working. It dies when it stops mattering. These airports were designed for volume, for flow, for growth that was once assumed to be permanent. Now they exist in a strange limbo, oversized, underused, and disconnected from the economic reality around them. The system technically operates, but it no longer serves the people it was built for. It serves bureaucracy. It serves appearances. It serves the illusion that nothing has changed. Walk through these terminals, and you can feel the mismatch instantly. Empty seating areas meant for crowds that never arrive. Retail spaces sealed behind metal shutters, not because of a crisis, but because demand quietly vanished. Flight schedules padded with long gaps, stretching time itself. The infrastructure is still there, but the life that justified it has drained away. This creates a specific kind of urban dysfunction that rarely gets discussed. When infrastructure continues without relevance, it becomes a burden instead of an asset. Maintenance costs remain, staffing costs remain. But the economic return collapses. Instead of supporting regional growth, these airports slowly siphon resources while offering diminishing value in return. And no one calls it a failure, because on paper, the system hasn't failed yet. Here's the unsettling part. This state can last for years, even decades. A terminal doesn't need to collapse physically to collapse socially. It only needs to stop being integrated into the future. Routes get redirected to larger hubs. Investments flow elsewhere. The airport becomes a peripheral object, still present, still operating, but strategically irrelevant. For the communities around these airports, the message is subtle but devastating. Connectivity shrinks. Job quality declines. Wages stagnate. Young people leave. What was once a gateway becomes a reminder that opportunity has moved on. And because nothing officially closes, there's no moment of outrage, no breaking point that forces accountability. This is how decline embeds itself into daily life, not through shock, but through quiet adjustment. People lower expectations. They adapt to inconvenience. They accept fewer options as normal. Over time, the idea that this infrastructure could serve a better purpose starts to feel unrealistic, even naive. And that's the real danger. When systems keep running after they stop serving human needs, they teach society to tolerate decay. They train people to confuse survival with success. These airports are not just underused facilities. They are signals of a city reallocating its future away from entire regions without ever saying it out loud. From the outside, movement still exists. Planes taxi slowly across the runway. Announcements echo through half-empty halls. A few passengers line up, scroll on their phones, wait. To a casual observer, this looks like continuity, like proof that the system is alive. But this motion is deceptive. It creates the impression of momentum without delivering any real direction. What's happening in these smaller New York airports is not growth in slow motion. It's inertia. There is a crucial difference between movement and progress, and these places expose it mercilessly. Flights still operate, but routes are thinner, less frequent, more fragile. Connections that once made sense economically now exist mainly to preserve appearances. The airport keeps moving, not because demand is strong, but because stopping would force uncomfortable admissions. Motion becomes theater. This is where the illusion becomes dangerous. As long as something appears active, people assume it's healthy. They don't question whether that activity is sustainable, meaningful, or even rational. A single daily flight can mask the loss of 10 that used to exist. A skeleton crew can replace a thriving workforce without triggering alarms. The system trains observers to accept less while calling it stability. Inside these terminals, time feels distorted. Long pauses between arrivals, extended waits at empty gates, staff members performing tasks out of routine rather than urgency. The rhythm of a functioning airport, fast, compressed, purposeful, is gone. What remains is a slowed-down imitation, a loop repeating itself without accumulating value. It looks like circulation, but it's closer to stagnation. This illusion of motion has a psychological effect on entire regions. It delays reckoning. Local governments hesitate to intervene because something is still happening. Investors stay away because nothing is clearly growing. Residents are left in limbo, unsure whether to hope or prepare to leave. The ambiguity itself becomes corrosive. Uncertainty drains confidence more efficiently than bad news ever could. There's also a strategic layer most people miss. In a centralized system like New York's, motion at the margin serves a purpose. It absorbs decline quietly. Instead of dramatic shutdowns that attract attention, the system allows peripheral infrastructure to fade slowly. Activity is reduced just enough to keep complaints manageable, just enough to avoid headlines. The illusion of motion buys time, not for recovery, but for reallocation elsewhere. And here's the unsettling insight. Once people adapt to this slowed, diminished version of normal, the idea of revival becomes abstract. Expectations reset downward. What once felt unacceptable starts to feel realistic. The illusion doesn't just hide collapse, it teaches people to live inside it. These airports are not frozen in time. They are drifting, and drift is far harder to confront than impact. Because when everything is still technically moving, no one feels responsible for changing direction. At the end, if this description mirrors something you've seen, a place that keeps running but clearly isn't going anywhere, remember it. We'll come back to that pattern. When something truly collapses, it usually does so in front of cameras. Fires, floods, shutdowns, mass layoffs, these are the kinds of events media outlets know how to cover. But what's happening in these smaller New York airports doesn't fit that template. There is no single day where everything breaks. No press conference, no dramatic announcement, and that's exactly why it goes largely unnoticed. Slow decline is invisible by design. News cycles thrive on disruption, not erosion. An airport that loses routes one by one over 10 years doesn't generate urgency. A terminal that feels emptier each season doesn't qualify as a crisis. The story never becomes newsworthy, even though its consequences are deeply real for the people living around it. Silence becomes the default condition. This is where media absence starts to function as a form of denial. If no outlet is reporting on a collapse, the public assumes there isn't one. If there's no headline, there must not be a problem. These airports exist in that blind spot, operational enough to avoid scandal, degraded enough to escape celebration. They fall between categories, and so they fall off the radar entirely. There's also a narrative bias at play. New York is marketed as a symbol of constant reinvention, resilience, and growth. Stories that contradict this image are inconvenient. A struggling mega-hub can be reframed as a temporary disruption. A failing small airport, however, threatens a deeper truth, that decline is uneven, selective, and structural. It reveals that the system doesn't lift all parts of the city, it sacrifices some to preserve others. Because of this, collapse at the margins becomes normalized. The absence of coverage sends a quiet signal. This loss is acceptable. It doesn't matter enough to investigate. Communities learn that their decline won't be documented, let alone addressed. And over time, this lack of visibility reinforces the very process that caused the decay in the first place. What makes this especially unsettling is that these airports are public infrastructure. They are supposed to represent collective investment, long-term planning, shared benefit. When their deterioration draws no attention, it exposes a deeper shift in priorities. The system is no longer oriented around maintaining access. It's oriented around maintaining image. And image only requires a few shining examples. A handful of flagship airports can carry the entire narrative of success. Everything else is allowed to rot quietly in the background. As long as the main symbols remain intact, the story holds. The rest becomes noise, or worse, silence. This is how collapse survives scrutiny. Not by hiding facts, but by spreading them thinly over time, places, and people that no one is watching closely. These airports don't disappear overnight. They dissolve slowly, and in doing so, they reveal how modern cities fail without ever being accused of it. If you've noticed places like this in your own city, systems that are clearly deteriorating but never discussed, hold on to that thought. It's a pattern, not an accident. For many smaller cities and towns across New York State, these airports were never just transportation hubs. They were anchors. They shaped local economies, markets, and even identity. Entire regions grew around the assumption that connectivity would always exist, that people, goods, and opportunity would keep flowing through these runways. When that assumption quietly breaks, the damage spreads far beyond the terminal. The collapse begins subtly. Fewer flights mean fewer visitors. Fewer visitors mean less demand for hotels, restaurants, rental cars, and local services. Businesses don't shut down all at once. They downsize. Hours are reduced. Staff is cut. Wages stagnate. The airport still stands, but the economic ecosystem it supported starts thinning out like a weakened circulatory system. What's often overlooked is the psychological impact on these communities. Airports symbolize relevance. They signal that a place is connected to something larger than itself. When that signal weakens, so does confidence. Young people begin to see fewer reasons to stay. Entrepreneurs hesitate to invest. The unspoken message becomes, this is no longer a place where futures are built, only where people remain. This shift alters daily life in ways that rarely make statistics. Commutes get longer as jobs move farther away. Medical access becomes harder when specialists stop flying in. Family visits become rarer when travel turns inconvenient and expensive. The airport's decline quietly restructures how people relate to time, distance, and possibility. There's also a deep sense of betrayal embedded in this process. These communities paid for this infrastructure through taxes, land, political support. They were promised integration into the broader New York economy. What they experience instead is abandonment without acknowledgement. The system doesn't say it's leaving. It simply stops showing up. And because the airport never fully closes, hope lingers in an unhealthy form. People wait for revival that never comes. Local leaders speak of future investments that remain vague. This prolonged uncertainty keeps communities suspended between past expectations and present limitations. It's not a clean ending. It's a slow erosion of agency. Over time, the airport transforms from a source of pride into a reminder of decline. Its empty parking lots, unused gates, and quiet terminals reflect back a painful truth. The city was built for a level of activity that no longer exists, and rebuilding around a shrinking hub is far harder than adapting to a clean break. These airports don't just reveal infrastructure failure. They expose how urban systems withdraw support without ever admitting it, leaving entire cities to absorb the consequences in silence. If this resonates, think about places you know that were designed for growth that never arrived, or that quietly disappeared. That pattern matters. For known destinations, tourism is supposed to soften decline. It brings money, visibility, and the promise of renewal. But around these smaller New York airports, tourism doesn't revive anything. It exposes the decay. Visitors arrive expecting efficiency, connectivity, and a city that knows how to receive people. What they encounter instead is friction, confusion, and an unsettling sense that something fundamental is missing. These airports still appear on maps. They're still listed as entry points. But the experience tells a different story. Limited flight options, long waits caused by understaffing, closed food counters, rental car desks with shortened hours. What should feel like arrival feels like interruption. The visitor isn't welcomed into a system. They're dropped into a gap. This creates a specific kind of tourism failure that rarely gets discussed. It's not overcrowding, it's not pricing, it's disorientation. Tourists leave with the feeling that they stumbled into a place that wasn't prepared to exist anymore. Expectations collapse quietly, just like the infrastructure itself, and disappointment spreads faster than marketing ever could. For local economies, this is devastating. Tourism depends on momentum. When visitors sense decay, they don't linger. They spend less. They don't return. Word of mouth turns cautious. Reviews become subtle warnings rather than open complaints. The result isn't a scandal. It's gradual avoidance. A place doesn't become infamous. It simply stops being chosen. There's also a deeper contradiction at play. These regions are often encouraged to lean into tourism as a solution for economic stagnation. But tourism requires functioning systems, transport, services, reliability. When airports fail silently, they sabotage the very strategy meant to replace what was lost. The system sets communities up for disappointment, then blames them when results don't follow. What's most revealing is how quickly this becomes normalized. Locals adjust their expectations of visitors. They apologize preemptively. It's not always like this, they say, even when it has been for years. This quiet acceptance mirrors the larger collapse. Everyone compensates individually for a failure no one officially acknowledges. Ghost tourism doesn't leave ruins. It leaves emptiness. It leaves places that look open but feel closed. And once that feeling takes hold, it's incredibly hard to reverse. Because tourism is not just about attractions, it's about trust. And these airports quietly erode that trust the moment someone lands. If you've ever traveled somewhere that felt unprepared to receive you, not chaotic, just hollow, you've felt this phenomenon firsthand. Behind every quiet terminal and half-empty runway, there are people whose lives are still anchored to these airports. Not travelers, workers, security staff, maintenance crews, airline employees, service contractors. They show up every day to systems that are slowly shrinking beneath their feet, and unlike passengers, they don't get to leave when things feel off. As activity declines, the nature of work changes in subtle but brutal ways. Fewer flights don't mean less stress. They mean fewer colleagues doing the same amount of responsibility. Shifts stretch. Roles blur. Workers are expected to cover more ground with less support, all while knowing that their position may not exist in a few years. Stability becomes conditional, not guaranteed. What makes this especially damaging is the psychological trap. These jobs are tied to infrastructure that cannot disappear overnight. As long as the airport remains open, employment feels technically secure. But opportunities to advance vanish. Training budgets dry up. Raises become rare. The job stops being a career and becomes a holding pattern, a place where people wait while the future quietly closes its doors. Many of these workers can't easily relocate. They live in nearby communities built around the airport's presence. Their social networks, housing, and family obligations are fixed. Leaving means starting over in systems that are already saturated elsewhere. Staying means accepting gradual erosion of income, dignity, and long-term prospects. There's also a deep emotional contradiction at play. Airports are supposed to symbolize movement and possibility. For the people who work inside these declining ones, they symbolize stagnation. Watching planes depart becomes a reminder that others still have options. The workers remain, performing rituals of connectivity while being increasingly disconnected from opportunity themselves. Because this decline is slow, there's no collective moment of resistance, no strike, no mass resignation, just quiet endurance. People adapt. They lower expectations. They tell themselves it's temporary, even as years pass. This is how systems extract labor until the very end. Not through force, but through uncertainty and hope. And when these airports finally do close or radically downsize, the narrative will frame it as an unfortunate but unavoidable decision. What won't be acknowledged is the long period before that moment, when workers were effectively trapped inside a structure already marked for decline. These people are not collateral damage, they are early indicators. Their experience reveals what happens when infrastructure is allowed to decay without accountability. The human cost accumulates quietly, long before the system admits failure. If this made you think of people you know who stayed too long in a shrinking system, remember that. We'll need it for what comes next. What's happening to these smaller New York airports is not random, and it's not the result of simple mismanagement. It follows a cold, efficient logic that governs modern urban systems: centralization. Resources don't disappear, they move. And in New York, they are being pulled toward a few highly visible, heavily defended nodes, while everything else is quietly left to wither. Centralization works best when it isn't announced. If officials openly declared that certain regions were no longer worth sustaining, resistance would follow. So, instead, the process unfolds through budget reallocations, route optimizations, and efficiency measures that sound neutral but carry irreversible consequences. One airport gets upgraded. Another simply stops receiving attention. Over time, neglect becomes policy without ever being named. From a systems perspective, this makes sense. Concentrating traffic into major hubs increases short-term efficiency. It simplifies logistics. It protects the image of strength. But socially, the cost is enormous. Peripheral regions lose connectivity, bargaining power, and relevance. They become dependent rather than integrated. The city no longer serves them. It extracts from them until they offer little in return. What's rarely acknowledged is how this reshapes inequality within the same metropolitan ecosystem. Central hubs flourish with investment, services, and visibility. Marginal airports decay quietly, taking their surrounding communities with them. Opportunity doesn't spread outward. It collapses inward. And the people outside the core are expected to adapt without complaint. This logic also distorts accountability. When decline is framed as market forces or traffic patterns, no one is responsible. The system appears self-regulating, almost natural. But these patterns are the result of choices about where to invest, what to maintain, and who gets access. Centralization is not neutral. It reflects priorities. For those living near these airports, the message is unmistakable. Their connection to the larger city is conditional. Their value is measured in throughput, not in people. Once volume drops below a certain threshold, support fades, regardless of the human cost. The infrastructure remains just intact enough to avoid outrage, just neglected enough to discourage reliance. This is how modern cities manage decline without confronting it. They don't collapse everywhere at once. They compress. They concentrate success into a few symbols and allow everything else to dissolve quietly. And as long as the core remains impressive, the system claims victory. But these smaller airports tell a different story. They show what centralization leaves behind. Not ruins, but absence. Not failure, but quiet exclusion. If you've ever felt like your area was slowly being deprioritized without explanation, that wasn't accidental. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of these smaller New York airports is not their emptiness, but the collective refusal to name what's happening. There is no official language for slow collapse, no press release that says, "This place no longer matters." Instead, there is silence, euphemism, and avoidance. Everyone senses decline, yet no one takes responsibility for acknowledging it. Institutions are especially skilled at this kind of denial. Reports emphasize operational continuity. Officials speak about temporary adjustments and long-term evaluations. Airlines cite shifting demand. Each explanation is technically true, but strategically misleading. Together, they form a fog where failure exists everywhere and nowhere at the same time. This denial doesn't just protect reputations, it protects the myth. Admitting that parts of New York's infrastructure are quietly collapsing would contradict the story of endless resilience and reinvention. It would force uncomfortable questions about priorities, inequality, and who the city is actually built for now. So the system chooses ambiguity. As long as nothing is declared broken, nothing has to be fixed. What's most damaging is how this institutional silence trains individuals to participate in it. Workers stop voicing concerns because nothing changes. Residents lower their expectations because complaints go unanswered. Local leaders learn to frame decline as patience, adaptation, or realism. Over time, people internalize the idea that this is simply how things are now. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. The less openly decline is discussed, the easier it becomes to deepen it. Budgets shrink further, services thin out more. The absence of outrage is interpreted as acceptance. Silence becomes consent. Not because people agree, but because they've been conditioned to believe that speaking up is pointless. There's also a psychological cost to living inside denial. When reality and official narratives no longer align, trust erodes. People feel gaslit by systems that insist everything is fine while daily experience says otherwise. This quiet dissonance fuels cynicism, disengagement, and emotional withdrawal from civic life. And yet, from the outside, everything still exists. The airport hasn't closed. Flights still land. Signs are still lit. This is why collapse can progress so far without resistance. The system remains visible, but its purpose has evaporated. What's left is infrastructure without honesty. These airports show what happens when no one is ready to admit that a system is failing, not because they don't see it, but because acknowledging it would require change they're unwilling to make. If you've ever felt that gap between official optimism and lived reality, keep that feeling in mind. It leads directly to the final question. These smaller New York airports are not anomalies. They are previews. They show, in slow motion, what happens when modern cities quietly outgrow the people and systems that once sustained them. What looks like a localized infrastructure issue is, in reality, a structural signal about where urban life is heading and who is being left behind in the process. The first revelation is uncomfortable. Cities no longer fail all at once. They fragment. They concentrate resources, attention, and investment into a few fortified cores while allowing everything else to decay gradually. The result isn't a dramatic collapse, but a layered one. Invisible to outsiders, deeply felt by those living inside it. These airports expose how decline is managed, not prevented. The second revelation is about priorities. When connectivity becomes selective, access turns into privilege. The city still functions, just not for everyone. Mobility, opportunity, and participation are quietly rationed. People don't lose these things overnight. They lose them through friction, inconvenience, and exhaustion. Eventually, leaving becomes easier than staying. That's not accidental. It's how systems rebalance without confrontation. There's also a profound cultural shift embedded here. Airports once symbolized optimism, expansion, and openness. Their slow decay mirrors a broader loss of confidence in shared futures. Urban life becomes transactional rather than aspirational. Survival replaces growth. Adaptation replaces ambition. The city stops asking what people need and starts asking what it can afford to ignore. Most importantly, these airports challenge the myth that decline only happens elsewhere. Not in global capitals, not in iconic cities, not in places too important to fail. They prove that no city is immune to erosion when denial, centralization, and image management take precedence over human impact. And here's the final tension. If this process continues unchecked, the question is no longer whether New York is collapsing, but what version of the city will remain. A connected metropolis for a shrinking few, or a fragmented landscape of privilege surrounded by quiet abandonment? These airports don't answer that question. They simply force it into the open. If you stayed until this point, it means you didn't just watch this video, you understood it, and that matters. What we explored here isn't about airports alone, but about a silent process reshaping cities, lives, and expectations without asking for permission. If this analysis helped you see New York, or urban life in general, in a different way, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. This space exists to uncover what usually goes unspoken, and your subscription is what allows this kind of deep, honest exploration to continue. Now I want you to leave a comment. Write this exact phrase if it resonates with you. Silent collapse is still collapse. Or, if you prefer, share one place you've seen slowly decline without anyone admitting it. Your comment isn't just engagement, it adds another real-world layer to this conversation. And if you found value here, leave a like. It signals that this kind of content deserves to reach people who are questioning the same myths, feeling the same pressure, and noticing the same cracks. Finally, don't stop here. The next video appearing on your screen continues this investigation from a different angle. Another system, another illusion, another silence worth paying attention to. Watch it while this perspective is still fresh.